Medieval castles began to be built on a large scale in Europe during the 10th–11th centuries. Originally, they served not only as defensive fortifications but also as centers of feudal power. These structures reflected the status of their owners and ensured control over the surrounding territories. Castles were built in strategic locations on hills, near rivers, and along important roads. The idea of the castle arose from the need for protection during constant wars and raids. The first castles were made of wood, but later, wood was replaced by stone. Stone castles became symbols of stability and strength. Massive walls protected against siege engines and projectiles. Castles were self-sufficient. They included storage rooms, wells, and sometimes chapels. They were designed to withstand prolonged sieges. Every element of the structure had a defensive purpose. Beyond their military role, castles also served administrative and judicial functions. Their architecture varied depending on region and era. Later castles began to include elements of comfort such as stone fireplaces and glass windows. However, the main goal remained defense and control. During the Crusades, castle building knowledge spread across the continent. New technologies were quickly integrated into architecture, but everything began with the choice of location and site preparation. The site for a castle was chosen with consideration of topography, hydrology, and defensive strategy. Elevated terrain provided visibility and made assaults more difficult. Rocky ground was preferred because it was sturdier and allowed access to building materials on site. A nearby water source like a river or spring was essential for drinking and possibly filling a moat. If no natural water source was present, wells were dug before construction began. Historians confirm that selecting the right location could take months. Once the site was chosen, earthworks began. The ground was leveled, and temporary wooden fortifications were erected. Layouts for future structures were marked using ropes and stakes. Engineers and architects worked together with surveyors in a medieval sense. Wooden scale models and parchment blueprints were used for planning. Laborers lived nearby, forming small temporary villages. Sometimes feudal lords conscripted local peasants to fulfill their duties. The first step was often the laying of the dungeon, the main keep or central tower. Storage buildings for tools and materials were also constructed early. Special attention was paid to reinforcing the foundation. Foundations were often several meters deep, especially beneath towers. They were built with large stones laid dry or with lime mortar. The strength of the foundation determined the longevity of the entire structure. Once the site was prepared, wall construction began. The primary building materials were limestone, granite, and sandstone. Stones were quarried nearby or even directly from the construction site. They were roughly shaped using hammers and chisels. Later, more precise tools like stone cutters and grinding plates were introduced. Stones were laid in horizontal layers, with lime mortar used as a binding agent. The mortar, a mix of lime, sand, and water, was aged for several weeks before use and applied manually between the stones. For additional strength, builders used metal clamps and dowels. In some castles, rubble masonry was used, large stones with smaller pieces filling the gaps. Walls could be 3–5 meters thick, and hollow sections inside the walls helped reduce weight. Stairs and hidden passages were sometimes built into the walls. Towers were constructed higher than walls to provide better visibility and defense. Wooden scaffolding was assembled and adjusted as the structure grew. Building a castle took 5 to 20 years, depending on its size. Up to several hundred workers were involved: stonemasons, blacksmiths, carpenters, and more. Skilled craftsmen sometimes came from distant cities or countries. Treadwheel cranes were used, operated by workers walking beside large wheels to lift heavy materials. Roofs were typically covered with slate or wooden shingles. Each construction stage was documented and inspected by a building overseer. Castles were designed with every known siege tactic in mind. The main defensive element was a tall, thick wall. These walls featured arrow slits, embrasures. Wooden galleries, or machicolations, were added along the tops of the walls for dropping objects on attackers. Towers had various shapes: round, square, or polygonal. Round towers were more resistant to battering rams and had no blind spots. The dungeon, or keep, was the most heavily fortified part and served as the last line of defense. Entrances were protected by a drawbridge and a portcullis, a heavy iron gate. Often, narrow passageways called killing zones, murder holes, were placed near entrances and were flanked by defensive positions. Gates were double-layered, with a gatehouse tower above. Some castles had underground escape tunnels in case of siege. Hidden staircases and secret rooms were also common. In the late Middle Ages, cannons began appearing, and castles were redesigned to withstand artillery. Bastions were added with gun ports, and towers were thickened and reinforced with metal plates. Castles were surrounded by moats or traps. Stone projections allowed defenders to drop boiling water or rocks on attackers. Some castles had flag or horn-based signaling systems. Interiors were usually austere, focused on function over decoration. Defensive planning covered everything from outer walls to inner sanctums. Structural strength was the main reason for their longevity. Castles were built with a margin of safety far exceeding what was required. Only time-tested materials and methods were used. Regular maintenance was a part of feudal responsibility. Even after losing their military value, many castles were used as administrative centers. Some passed into the hands of other rulers and were renovated or expanded. Certain castles became royal or ducal residences. Over time, they became historic landmarks. In the 19th century, a renewed interest in Gothic architecture led to restorations. Some castles were rebuilt, but many preserved original features. And that's all. Thank you for your attention.